Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this event, which is called Talking About Ice, Landscape Photography, Climate, which we've conceived of as a conversation held at the intersection of polar research, landscape photography, and climate activism, following up on images and ideas in Ice Moments, photographs by Klaus Hochheim, an exhibition this spring and summer at our gallery here on campus, MHC Gallery, and a book published by CMU Press. My name is Sue Sorensen, and I am the director of CMU Press, and I'm grateful to be a guest on territory cared for since time immemorial by Anishinaabe, Cree, and Dakota peoples, and others, including more recently the Red River Métis. Our campus sits on Treaty 1 lands, and we access clean drinking water from Treaty 3 territory, and we use hydro generated in Treaty 5 territory. I am grateful. CMU is committed to the righting of past wrongs and to building meaningful relationships with the descendants of the First Peoples here and with all of creation. We do not always succeed in these commitments. We falter and stumble, but we are hopeful, and we will keep on this path. I want to thank MHC Gallery for being the partner with CMU Press throughout this project, especially Sarah Hodges-Kalisnik and Graham Unrau. Thanks to Common Word, our bookstore partner, and especially Arlen Friesen-Epp, who has opened the bookstore tonight for you, and has helped to organize tonight's event and is hosting the live stream. And you'll see that Common Word is open this evening, so we encourage you not only to get this book tonight, which we've put on at a special Christmas price for 1/3 off, but you can do your Christmas shopping at Common Word. And this book will continue to be on sale for 1/3 off until the last day of Common Word before Christmas, which is December 23rd, so you can tell your friends. I'm here to do quick introductions of people that are taking part in this conversation tonight, and then I'll step back. But before I do these introductions, I just wanted to let you in on a little tidbit of celebration, and basically I want some ideas. I just recently realized that CMU Press is 50 years old. We are a very small publishing company. We're so small that we don't even pay attention to how old we are. We're just so busy. Mostly it's been run by professors, mostly publishing academic books, but I suddenly realized a couple of weeks ago we have been doing this since 1974, and that's 50 years. So right now I'm asking everybody for ideas. We haven't come up with very many so far. So I think, probably we'll have a 50th anniversary sale and put everything on for 50% off. I don't know. But if you can think of something better than that, please let me know. So yay us, we're 50 years old. Introductions. I've worked closely with the director of MHC Gallery here on campus, Sarah Hodges-Kalisnik, throughout the publication of this book. And Sarah is not only the co-curator of this book and exhibition, and the director of our gallery here on campus, but she's also a fine photographer herself, so we're hoping that she can enlighten us about photography this evening. Sarah has an excellent essay about photography in this book. Ice Moments has photographs by Klaus Hochheim, but also essays by Sarah and our second contributor, David Babb, who knew Klaus and who, like Klaus, works as an ice researcher through the Center for Earth Observation Sciences at U of Manitoba. David was in the north for some of our previous events celebrating this book, so he's finally here tonight in the south. Thank you for being willing to be part of this project, and for the essay in this book, which helps to unpack the science that we'll touch on tonight. Our third contributor is an old friend of mine, Josiah Neufeld. Josiah is a journalist and author who's involved in climate activism here in Winnipeg, so he'll probably give you a flyer tonight and ask you to sign a petition. He's also teaching right now at CMU, teaching creative writing, nonfiction in the English department. And his book, The Temple at the End of the Universe, A Search for Spirituality in the Anthropocene, came out last year, and I believe you can find it in Common Word. And your host for a conversation in a moment is Kenton Loby, who teaches international development and environmental studies here at CMU. And he reminds us in his official bio that he is most comfortable as a teacher practitioner, and farming is as important to Kenton as teaching and learning. So before this panel comes up and we have a little conversation, I want to just say briefly that this project, where a bunch of us started talking about ice, looking at ice, marveling at ice, worrying about ice, this Ice Moments project began when the photographs of the late Dr. Klaus Hochheim, ice scientist and photographer, came to our attention, and they were brought to us by his wife, Martha. To mark the 10th anniversary of his accidental passing in a helicopter accident in the north, which also claimed the lives of 2 others, Martha came up with the idea of an exhibition of his amazing photographs of Arctic and Antarctic regions. He took thousands of them. It was a massive project to distill them all down to the number that we were able to include in the exhibition and are in this book. She brought this idea to us at CMU, and we are so glad she did. So now I'd like to ask Martha up to tell us a little bit about Klaus. Please join me in welcoming Martha Hochheim.
Just want to welcome you all. Thank you for coming. It's getting close to the holiday season, and I know it's people are, dividing their time up between many things. So thank you for making time to come. I also want to thank you to the esteemed panel members and for your willingness to participate in what will surely be an enlightening evening. I'd like to share a little bit about Klaus, as Sue has mentioned, and provide that insight on how we sort of got here today. So Klaus was a first-generation Canadian growing up in a home that was surrounded with cameras, 35mm cameras, 8mm movie cameras, and a home darkroom where at a young age he learned from his father to develop both the film and the print. He would spend hours experimenting with light and time to create the perfect image. Klaus would take selfies before they were easily achieved, and I learned early in our relationship that his camera would always be within easy reach. During his undergrad degree at the U of W, Klaus was introduced to remote sensing technology, and his interest was piqued. His BA honors work was to identify and map iceberg gouges in the Lake Agassiz Basin using aerial photographs. Following this, Klaus was admitted to a 1-year program specializing in remote sensing at the Nova Scotia Land Survey Institute, and so our family moved across the country. The program was focused on satellite, thermal, microwave sensing, as well as digital image analysis, and all things which are sort of foreign to me, but I did learn a little bit. So upon returning to Winnipeg, his first contract work was with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, where Klaus would be introduced to the Arctic and research there. So Klaus was hired to operate a large format camera mounted over the port of the floor of a Twin Otter aircraft and conduct marine mammal surveys alongside the DFO biologists. The data was then analyzed and using his remote sensing skills. That was the process. So it was during those flights that he met and worked with David Barber. Their meeting would cement a lifelong collaboration. Dr. Barber was not only a friend but mentor to Klaus and also his academic supervisor during his PhD studies at the University of Manitoba. So about Klaus's master's degree, I'll quote what David Babb has written in the book of Ice Moments. He submitted an essay titled From Prairies to Poles, and it reads, his master's work was at the cutting edge of agriculture remote sensing and was honored with a Weir Award in 1995 for the best master's thesis in the Department of Geography at the University of Manitoba. Dr. Babb also provides in this essay a summary of Klaus's varied research work over the years. Thank you so much for David, for your friendship to Klaus and contributing your expertise in both the book as well as this evening's panel discussion. So as a research associate at the University of Manitoba, Klaus's specialty was in sea ice climatology and remote sensing. So Klaus traveled extensively through the Arctic on his many travels. His camera gear was always with him, identified, priority, carry-on, tagged, and stickered. Many of the photographs displayed in the book are from 2008, which was the fourth International Polar Year Circumpolar Flaw Lead System Study. That's a mouthful. And so the Amundsen overwintered in the Arctic rather than returning to Quebec City. And together with scientists from all over the world, they would study changes in Arctic sea ice, each scientist contributing their expertise towards a collaborative effort. Klaus was on a regular scheduled rotation on the Amundsen during this time, and he'd arrive, as everyone did, on a small plane on an airstrip marked on the frozen snow-covered Arctic Ocean, reasonably near the Amundsen. You'll see a picture of an airplane, a snowmobile, other mode of transport, and then the ship in the background, and that was arrival in the Arctic during that winter. So the frequent trips, along with extreme conditions, provided lots of opportunity for unique archival photography, and there was opportunity to take selfies in the reflection of the all-sky camera, which was mounted on the ship deck. So Klaus would take his picture in there in the reflection, and often he was very bundled up, and the conditions were visible there. At other times, he was in a shirt sleeve, and in the book, there's a photograph of him on his 50th birthday with the bright sky at 2 a.m. on June 21st, 2008. Klaus's love for photography correlated well with his work. It required skill to photograph frost flowers that are often only 1 centimeter in size. To study ice meant at times preserving its natural habitat, or as we know, it would melt. So infrared photography was proving useful in the study of frost flowers, and so Klaus began experimenting with this camera prior to his travels to the Antarctic in 2010. So now with 2 cameras in tow, it was possible to double up on the number of pictures that he captured. He, of course, noted that artistic possibilities with the infrared images would also give some very interesting scenes, and so some of those are examples in the book and on the screen that you saw earlier. So on a more personal level, Klaus, as we all know now, loved photography. He also was a passionate cyclist, and then came his fetish for footwear, or maybe the footwear prioritized over his bike. But Klaus loved a good pair of sandals, and I remember the pair that he had when we first met was from Detroit Lakes. It was around 1979, and he was so thrilled that the sole was made out of car tire material. Sadly, the leather gave out before the tread. So from there, he moved on to Birkenstocks, and several months ago, I was looking again through a file of photos and came across a series of selfies that Klaus took regularly in that all-sky camera. And this was a series where he moved from close up to further out and then back in again. And the shot furthest out included his footwear, his Birkenstocks. And I was suddenly reminded of Klaus's love for them. He wore them constantly, and I was okay with that, barefoot in Birks in the summer. But in the fall came the socks and sandals, and that was just weird, which I let him know many times, but to no avail. This practice was, of course, from many years ago and didn't change. It started in the 80s. And interestingly, at that time, the hospital that I worked at, the new ER docs were all doing the same. Who knew that Klaus was on trend, or maybe even an influencer? So I began what became a 4-year process in 2020, knowing the 10th anniversary of his passing was imminent. I began the task of going through the many photo files, selecting favorites from thousands of pictures. Not really knowing where this would take me, it became apparent that his photographic work needed to be shared with the world. I approached MHC Gallery and connected with Sarah Hodges-Kolesnik. With her expertise in photography, she was the right person at the right time. She recognized Klaus's artistic aesthetic, and this set the wheels in motion to not only the exhibition, but also a collaboration with Sue Sorensen, CMU press editor, to publish this book. So it's with much gratitude that I stand before you today with my copy of Ice Moments in hand. The goal was worthy for an extraordinary man that was lost too soon. Klaus is missed in life, but his memory lives on. The camera holding true from his childhood to beyond mortality. His work brings together science and humanity, wonder and primordial beauty, juxtaposed with the urgency of a changing climate.
Thank you, Martha. And I'm going to invite our guests up here to sit on these stools up here. My name is Kenton Loby, and I will be your adept and hopefully capable conversation leader this evening. It's good to have folks close, so I appreciate those of you that have moved into the orbit of intimate conversation. It's lovely to think about. I think at the end of your piece, Dave, you talked about the ability of abstract remote sensing to provide intimate detail. And so, yeah, we have this abstract, intimate thing going on here, too. It's good to have the three of you here. Landscape photography and climate are kind of broad categories that went out with the posters to think about how we might engage a conversation. This is not a book launch. This is a conversation about material within the book and the topics that are within the book. And so it's a privilege to gather with CMU Press and writers, photographers, and scientists who have, those are simply one of the things that I imagine we may hear from you about tonight. The plan for tonight is to have a little bit of time for these three to share a little bit about their expertise and their thinking. I've not given them a lot of detail, and Dave will tell me at the end whether that was a smart idea or not. But I've asked them to say a little bit by way of introduction, to give you a bit of a sense of who's here, to give me a bit of a sense who's here, and for me to craft some questions that might shape a dialogue that follows that. So first a round of introductions, and maybe we'll start with Dave and move our way here towards Josiah. I'll have some questions. I'm hoping the three of them will have some conversation and questions for each other. And I know there's some folks here in the gathered audience that also have some, that may have some questions. And I think if Martin is right, that there is a possibility of bringing in questions from those who may be zooming in online. So that's the layout for this evening. By way of introductions, Dave Babb.
All right. Hi. I'm David Babb. I'm a CA scientist at the University of Manitoba. I was fortunate to work with Klaus in the Arctic from 2009 up until the day of the crash. And yeah, it's great to be here. CMU and the gallery has done an incredible job with this project and this book. I spend a lot of time in the Arctic living in some of these scenarios, and even some of the pictures sort of still take my breath away. Klaus's ability to capture the different scales and the different colors of the Arctic is really incredible. I mean, this one is amazing. The melt ponds on top of the ice, it's beautiful. As beautiful as it is, though, it's still difficult to capture. And this is, I think, the thing that made Klaus so special and his photographs so special was I take a lot of pictures up there and I come back and my family looks at me and says, Dave, it's all white. There's no depth, there's no detail, there's no texture. And in the book, and the gallery, some of the things that always impressed me was just Klaus's ability to capture all of that. So it's great to be here.
Thanks, Dave. Sarah.
Okay. Can
Are you
hear
on
me?
there? Are we on back there?
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Sorry. So, as has been mentioned, I'm the curator at MHC Gallery and the director there. And I love photography. I've always loved photography. Taught photography for many years, taught history of photography. So I'm going to geek out and talk about photography for a moment. Because I think it's a medium that stretches and defies definition and boundaries. At its core, it's this unique blending of science and art. It's an alchemic process of light-sensitive materials like silver, combined with an aesthetic eye to create a tool for visual design. But photography is also useful to capture big ideas that affect us all, as well as our most intimate moments. It's at once personal and public, document and expression, science and art. And for all its conceptual nuances, at the end of the day, photography, and indeed all art, like science, stems from a desire to connect to the mysteries of our worlds. Science might seek to quantify, to articulate, to answer, and art delves into murkier territory where we feel, process, react, and respond. So when Martha shared Klaus's work with me, as a good curator, my job was to try and figure out what makes a good photograph, one worthy of display and dialogue and printing in a book, and especially what makes a scientist's work good to fit in a gallery space. Klaus's photographs, as you can see, like all photographs, are simply and scientifically a reproduction of a moment in time using reflected light. The camera is an instrument of objectivity, recording the scene exactly as it exists in front of us. But of course, there's something more to a good photograph, to all objects that we dare to call art. Sometimes we call it spirit, good seeing. Cartier-Bresson called it decisive moment. But it is that moment when skill, luck, vision, and context all align to express something beyond simple reproduction. And that's what we experience in Klaus's work. On the one hand, Klaus's images are a time capsule, an objective document of a few years of study, a few specific projects in a few specific locations, which in this day and age of climate crisis could be a compelling study of change in the polar regions just as that. But Klaus's photographs go further. In elevating these landscapes, in elevating his fellow scientists and these quotidian details with his camera, Klaus connects us, the viewers, to his own way of knowing these places and these moments with his whole being. Klaus's legacy is to know our polar places through relationship, through place-based knowledges, through science, and through feeling. And with this new shared bond to our ice-filled places, it creates a sense of dialogue about what has changed in the face of climate change and perhaps a sense of urgency about what has not.
Thank you, Sarah. Josiah.
Hi there, I'm Josiah. I'm a writer, I'm a journalist, I'm a community organizer for climate justice here in Treaty 1 territory, Winnipeg. I sometimes hesitate to use the word activist to describe myself. The only reason I hesitate is because I feel like it lets everyone else off the hook. I'm not the work of climate justice organizing. That work is the work for all of us here, whether we're the kind of person who likes to march in the street or sits at a desk or takes photographs. I'm coming to this as somebody who, I don't know a lot about photography. I don't know a lot about Arctic ice. I'm excited to learn more about it, but any conversation about Arctic ice is necessarily a conversation about climate change, and one thing I do know is about local responses to the climate crisis, what's happening here in Manitoba to respond, and groups that are doing really vital and necessary work to respond to climate change in a holistic kind of way. So I'm grateful to be included on this panel, even though I'm not an expert on ice or photography.
Landscape, photography, climate. Climate, right? Thanks, Josiah. Welcome here. It seems I sent a note to these folks yesterday, late evening, after I'd read through the book the first time, read it through again this morning, enjoyed it immensely, and ask them to trust me as like we're in a jazz performance and you're the performers here. It seems to me like a place to start is the landscape. Dave, you're just back. We were talking before, and Sue mentioned that Dave was not able to be here for the launch, that there is a difficulty, there is a distance that exists between the south and the north in this place. And I'm wondering if you can, the pictures give us a visual, but the stories. What's it like? I don't know how many people here have been to the Arctic. I certainly have not. And so I value storytellers and folks that can bring that firsthand observation, which seems like the skill of scientists, that careful noticing. Sure. What would you want to tell us about the Arctic and the research that's going on, and how that might impact some of the questions Josiah might ask about urgency and change?
Yeah, absolutely. I should note that there's been 3 events related to this book, and the first one I had just returned back from Greenland. The second one I was stuck on a ship up north and I had to miss. Fortunately, a colleague filled in last minute and gave an excellent presentation. And this one, I just got home from Eureka late last night. So somehow these 3 events have lined up with my 3 field seasons this year. I mean, the Arctic it's a remote, it's desolate, it's quiet, it's peaceful, it's stunning. Sometimes I think, and I was having this feeling, sometimes walking on ice, like getting off the side of a ship and walking on what we call a large ice floe, I think is the closest I'll ever feel to walking on the moon, because no one has ever been there before. You, in most cases, in almost all cases, are the first person to be walking through this area. And I think there's kind of something incredible about that. In terms of the landscape, I mean, it can feel endless. You can see for miles and miles and miles, and it's just white, or this interspersed covering of open water and ice. 24 hours of daylight when we go up during summer is a whole other experience. You lose complete track of time. One year we were working in northeastern Greenland, and we were doing a CTD transect across the ice, and somebody finally looked at their watch and said, "Guys, it's 2 in the morning. We need to get back to the station. We've been out till 2 in the morning." So you lose complete track of time. The sun just goes around and around and around, and you lose track of time. Conversely, I was just up north, and it was polar night. So it's black, it's dark. The second you get away from the station, it is just pitch black. We were delayed, and one of the joys of the delay was actually that we were there for the full moon. And so being in total darkness in polar night is minus 30 degrees, there's blowing snow like that. But to be guided by a full moon and to be able to use the full moon to see the mountains around you and get a sense for the area is really incredible. So yeah, in terms of the landscape of the Arctic, I mean, it's just something that always strikes me is it's so remote, it's empty, it is quiet, but it's also beautiful and really, really peaceful.
Thanks, Dave. Sarah, I'm thinking of photographs, and there may be things that you would like to ask Dave or that you'd like to ask, just please. But the curation and the photography and the display. You had this at the MHC Gallery. You had folks in the summer to see. I imagine that's fun. I imagine. I'm not a curator. I do like to take photographs, and when I share photographs, I feel like it's fun. It can be fun. Well, what kinds of responses, what kinds of impacts, what kinds of effects did you see on folks that were feeling and seeing these things, this art and science alchemy that you're talking about?
So I think I was really grateful to Martha, who kind of let me take everyone on this journey of experiencing these photographs in a almost larger than life kind of way. Some of the landscape photographs that have that power to transport you to these other places that have a little bit of that otherworldly look, we printed them pretty much as large as we could. They took up the entire section of wall in the gallery. So when you were standing in the main section when you first come in, you kind of felt like you were surrounded by these vast landscapes of ice, like you might if you were actually there. So a lot of people commented on that feeling of being transported to that place, of the size of the photographs, of kind of being able to almost walk into the landscape and connecting with them that way. But we had people from all over the world coming to check out the exhibit, and we had someone from France who spent like a good hour in the gallery telling me about how he had visited the Arctic and seen penguins and taken pictures and all these kinds of things. So lots of sharing of stories for those who had experienced that landscape, that particular landscape, but also lots of good conversations about climate change, about the scientists working there. We did kind of set it up that the main floor of the gallery space felt like you were in the Arctic or Antarctic. And then upstairs was more of a documentary approach, the photographs that featured the scientists, the penguins, of course, which the kids, the kids at camp love the penguins. So yeah, a lot of thinking about the experience and trying to take the guests through these different experiences of what Klaus would have been seeing and experiencing.
What kinds of conversations about climate did you have? Like, Mennonite Central Committee is encouraging. I do a lot of work in international development, environmental studies, community organizing, maybe a bridge. And they're talking about, in their advocacy campaigns for supporters of Mennonite Central Committee, to have conversations about climate over Christmas.
Oh,
and I always think,
yeah.
oh, wouldn't that be fun over around the table? But it assumes a kind of weight and anxiety around the conversation. What did you notice?
Yeah, we had a lot of conversations about the fact that these photographs were made 10 to 15 years ago. So what has changed, what hasn't? And we actually had a talk, as David had mentioned, that focused specifically on that, what kinds of conversations we're having in the art world and in the science world today, and how do they differ? How are they the same? And a lot of Klaus's research is still being used to inform studies that are going on right now. And I think a lot of people were surprised at some of the scientific models we saw in that talk about how ice coverage has changed in the last 10 years and how much less there is. And David, I'm sure you can speak a lot more specifically to those kinds of things than I can. But yeah, there were a lot of people who I think had that sense of urgency and asked a lot of questions. And it ended up being framed a little bit in the like, how would this affect a polar bear, 10 years from now or today or versus 10 years ago. So
the time factor, even as you're watching on the wall there. Do you want to say a little bit about the current ice? I'm going to come to you with a second on ice observations and cycling. But do you want to say a word about like the state of research? Like what has happened in the last 15 years that people need to understand?
The Arctic ice pack historically was, stayed rather extensive throughout the year. The Canadian Arctic stayed ice covered throughout much of summer, and then obviously as well as winter. But the satellite record goes back over 40 years now, and there's a steady decline through that whole period. So every month of the year, we now have less and less ice in the Northern Hemisphere. The situation is a little bit different in the Southern Hemisphere, but that's a bit of a different topic right now. But the Northern Hemisphere, less and less ice every year, and also a significant transition within the ice pack itself. It's not this old, thick, what we call multi-year sea ice that survives for years and years and years and grows thicker and thicker and thicker. It's now this much thinner seasonal ice cover, most of it growing in kind of the autumn freeze-up, surviving through winter, and then melting out during summer. And so we get these larger areas of open water. And one of the big things that happens in the Arctic is you get these feedbacks. So you lose a little bit of ice, that just further amplifies the warming. So, let's say you lose 1 unit of ice, the next year the amplification of that process might lead to the loss of 2 units of ice, and it just sort of compounds itself over time. I was preparing some information for another thing, and the annual September minimum, which is sort of when sea ice makes some headlines every year, that's when sea ice falls to its annual minimum, and then March we reach our annual maximum. And so the maximum is about 14 million square kilometers in the Northern Hemisphere. In summer, it's dropped from about 7 or 8 million square kilometers in September, and we're now down about 4 million square kilometers. So we're about half. And then you add to that the ice is much thinner itself too. And so sort of the index that people are looking to, and sort of what Alex would have talked about during his talk in the summer, is when we have what we're going to call a seasonally ice-free Arctic Ocean. And that is when the entire Arctic ice pack melts out during summer. And when you look at this in climate models, there's quite a bit of consensus now that this is going to happen by the middle of this century. So right now, like I said, we're about 4 million square kilometers. For specific reasons, they define an ice-free Arctic during September as anything below 1 million square kilometers. So it's not a total zero, but it's less than 1 million square kilometers. And that's projected to occur. I mean, it's 2024, about to be 2025. We're only 25 years away from the middle of this century. Some papers suggest it'll happen as early as the 2030s. Of course, there's a lot of variability in what the models see. We also see that in the Arctic too, while there is this nice long-term linear decrease, nice is maybe not the best word to use there, but there is this long-term linear decrease. You do see these years of rapid loss. So there are specific years. I mean, one thing I always like about being an Arctic scientist based in Winnipeg is we can all relate to the cold. And we all know that, certain winters are bloody cold outside, and some winters it's quite warm. And as much as we consider that to be nice because it makes it easier to take your kids outside and to ski and walk outside, in the Arctic, an abnormally warm winter leads to thinner ice. That ice is more likely to melt. It changes some of the dynamics. And so, all this to say, though, you still have variability, but you do have these years of rapid loss. And during these years, that is when an event such as an ice-free Arctic Ocean might occur. And then based on these feedbacks, once you do have that event occur, it becomes inherently more likely to continue to occur. It's tough for ice to recover once it has been lost. Once you replace ice that reflects a lot of the sun's energy with open water that's going to absorb the sun's energy, it's tough to sort of overcome that inertia in the system and regrow an ice cover, if we're going to look at it that way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Josiah, it seems to me like there's a lot, so in environmental studies, the communication of science, of what you just did, of like, how do you communicate that to people? In community organizing, I imagine that's at the center of a lot of what you do. How does that work? What are you noticing about doing that work? Are you a scientist? Like, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know where I dropped grade 11 bio, and I've regretted it ever since. But what have you noticed about communicating climate?
I know one science word. I just remembered it while I was listening.
Good.
From my first year university classes. Albedo. That's a word I'm sure you can talk about.
He just talked about that, right?
He did, yes.
Yeah. Good work.
I'll leave it to the scientists to describe it in detail. But listening to them talk, I'm reminded of the kind of the different roles that different people play. And the scientists are the observers, the witnesses. They're kind of the eyes for the rest of us, seeing what's happening, observing what's happening in our world, to our ecosystems. And then you have the artists who are, in some ways, an artist's job is to make us care, to engage our emotions. It sounds, looking at the photographs, I never met Klaus, but clearly he was an artist as well as a scientist, and that draws in, the emotion, and the curators, gallery, people who organize these exhibits are participating in that relationship. And then you have the writers and the journalists, like people like me who try to tie these things together and present the science in ways that are digestible to a very broad audience, also in a way that hopefully makes people care. And then you have the activists, community organizers whose job it is to agitate and to create mechanisms to put pressure on the politicians and the leaders whose job it is ultimately to change policy in a way that that moves us in a different direction, in a way that's healthier for our communities and for people who are, struggling to, pay for their groceries. There's a very, very real connection between people paying for groceries and melting sea ice and the kinds of, fiscal policies we have in this country. These things are all interconnected, and there's different roles that different people are playing along the way. And then there's the citizens who are, all of us in this room have some form of, influence with our elected officials, city councilors, MLAs, MPs, and others, and we have a role in that ecosystem too. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Tell us a little bit about some of them, like some of the work I know that you've been up to give a sense for the audience here. Like, what does that look like when you're doing the community organizing, the communicating with politicians, the advocacy work, church basements, wherever it might be happening?
Right.
What do you...
Yeah, I'll mention a few different, there's a lot going on in Manitoba in terms of climate justice organizing. I'll just mention a few groups that I'm part of. So I'm part of the Mennonite Church Manitoba Climate Action Working Group. Kenton is part of that group, and we meet in churches and church basements and try to, engage church people with the conversation about climate change and what justice looks like in our communities, how we can put pressure on our elected officials for better climate policy. We're kind of figuring that work out as we go. I'm also part of a group, a newish group that I helped bring together called the Interfaith Coalition for CEIR. CEIR stands for CEIR, stands for the Community Energy Investment Roadmap. And if you've never heard of it, that's not a big surprise because very few people have heard about it. This is Winnipeg's net zero climate plan. They commissioned a study to say what would it look like for our city to get to net zero emissions by the year 2050. A very robust study that looks at transportation, dramatically expanding public transit, getting all our buildings off of burning natural gas and using heat pumps, ground source heat pumps and air source heat pumps. And building more wind and solar energy. What would it actually look like to get there? We have this plan. We've got a great study. It lays out the steps. It's a significant investment in money. Also, nothing's really happening. It's sitting on a shelf, gathering dust, like many of the studies at City Hall. So this group that I helped kind of bring together, it's specifically people from faith communities. There's Mennonites, there's United Church folks, there's a variety represented. And we started meeting in my living room over stew and saying, how can we as communities of faith, start making our elected officials realize a lot of people care about this obscure little, not an obscure study, it should be known by everyone, but it's not being implemented. So we went through the study, we looked at the various steps and the different things that needed to be done, and we started meeting, just calling up our city councilors and and having meetings with them. And they always, it's a little bit different when a group of, they're used to dealing with people whose job it is to engage with city councilors. All of a sudden you get a room full of people representing 20 different churches and faith communities around the city. There's a large group of people represented, so they pay attention to that. So we've had some really successful meetings. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of, at the municipal level, in terms of organizing around better public transit, and we need to be building more bus lanes and have a way better public transit system instead of expanding our city continually into the suburban areas and building bigger, wider roads that encourage more people to drive instead of taking the bus. There's a lot of very specific policy stuff that we could be doing, like the tools are within our reach. So part of our work in this group is to push city councilors in that direction. And the third group that I'll mention that I'm part of, Manitoba Energy Justice Coalition, we've recently launched a campaign aimed at the provincial government. So the other group was engaging with the municipal, with the City of Winnipeg. The campaign we've got, it's called the Power Up campaign. There's a few flyers just throughout the room and some on that table back there. You can take a look at it. There's a link to a petition you can sign, and it's specifically calling on the provincial government to do three things: to build more wind, solar, and geothermal, to end the use, over a period of time in a good way, phase out the use of natural gas in buildings. Natural gas is 95% methane. Methane is one of the most potent greenhouse gases that's contributing to climate change. We don't need to be burning that stuff. We can be heating our homes with air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps. And then the third thing is to invest in energy efficiency especially for low income and rental households, because good energy policy is also good people policy. It means making life more affordable for people who are struggling. So those are a few of the things that I'm involved in, and any of you are welcome to join me in any of those groups or undertakings. So if you want to know more, if you want to get on any email newsletter lists from the Mennonites, the interfaith group, the broad general public group, come talk to me.
Thanks, Josiah. It's an active community here, to be sure. I want to ask if there are folks in the audience. I know there are folks in the audience that have things to say. They have told me, and I'm watching time and realizing a conversation moves quickly. I'd like to get to the art and science thing a little more. Sarah and Dave talking about that alchemy that you talked about. I imagine writers are also involved in that alchemy. I'm reading Barry Lopez, Arctic Dreams, with students, and what he can do with words feels very different but akin to what you can do with photographs. So I'm thinking about that. But I just want to open up a space here. If there are folks that have questions at this moment, there's a microphone over here so that we can catch it for our folks online. John Brubaker, why don't you start us off? It's an intimate small group here, and I have a great view. The microphone's right beside Rachel over here.
And I should go over to
Yeah, you should go to the microphone, yep.
I think I've got... I'm on? Am I? Really? Oh, yeah, so I am. John Brubaker. I teach biology here at CMU. And I'm struck, Dave, by, often when we talk about science, or when people who maybe are not scientists talk about science, it's in the context of technology and, increasing our control, possession, sort of mastery of the world around us. What I really love about Klaus's book, and just hearing you talk about your work as well, is the way it gets us thinking about science as kind of a sensory experience. And I guess I'm just kind of looking to ask you to riff on that a little bit more. Well, when Josiah talks about, scientists as the eyes, I'm just thinking about, and Kenton, you're talking about science as noticing, I think, as well. When you're out in the field, in a place where time really runs differently, how does that shape even just the way you are back here as well, is kind of my question.
Yeah. First, the discussion of scientists as the eyes and sort of the different roles that go into this. This is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. When these COP meetings roll around, it always highlights to me that I am in the avenue of the eyes. I'm there observing the ice and understanding the changes and the processes that are taking place. I'm not on the side where we're talking about the, divesting from oil and gas and cutting emissions. That is I don't know, it just always highlights for me the lane that I fall into. And I do think there are some scientists that do a great job of bridging those different roles. And I think those people are really unique and powerful. Okay, but the feel of the Arctic. Okay, so I had the same supervisor as Klaus, Dave Barber, who has since passed away, and I know that something that Dave always really believed in was you couldn't just be a scientist and study the Arctic and stay down here. You couldn't tuck yourself away in your office. I mean, Klaus was a remote sensor. You can sit in your office down south and look at satellite images of sea ice and never go touch sea ice. And Dave was always a big believer in you had to go get your hands cold. You had to go understand what it was like up there. And even if that was just as simple as going on a ship or sitting in a field camp or whatever it was, whatever your experience was, you had to go and sort of gain that experience and that understanding before you could then come back and try to understand the processes or the system. Yeah. Does that sort of get it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sarah,
Okay, yeah.
you look like you're ready. You got something to say.
No, I
Or
was
you're just getting ready for a mic stand that keeps
yeah.
falling over.
That too. Yeah, no, I was going to say that I think one of the things that came out in Klaus's work to me is this idea of being in relationship, not just with other scientists, but with a place and with all these different ways of knowing. And I think in talking with with Martha and getting to know more about Klaus, that definitely seemed like something that was important in his work. Maybe he picked up from his mentors as well. But I think that's something that's really important in what artists do and what artists bring in imagining how we move through these challenging times and beyond these challenging times. And I don't remember what your question was, John, as we've talked through this. But artists are world makers. We imagine worlds beyond where we are now. And we need the science to help understand the problems. We need the activists and the writers to help us articulate and to work with the politicians to make these changes. But we also need to imagine how we're going to live in this mess that we've made and how we're going to live beyond it and how we're going to thrive in these places. And that's what artists are really good at helping us do.
You had that line that we talked about before, Donna Haraway, who is adjacent to someone that my students read in a third-year Environment, Society, and Resilience course. If you haven't got the book, it's on page 21, last paragraph. It's where I guess that's where artists hit home with their thing. It's lovely. It's just like writers. Staying with the trouble. Staying with the trouble. Can you riff on that, Josiah? How do you stay with the trouble? Like, what you're talking about is a love letter that Klaus is writing, right? An affection for landscape that gets at the feel that Brubaker is asking about. But staying with the trouble. Love does some work. Fear does some work in the climate active action community. Do you want to riff on those? Like love letters, fear, how do you begin to move and activate and engage?
Yeah, staying in the trouble. Activists like trouble. Sometimes activists are accused of causing trouble. I think that a lot of activists would say that they're drawing attention to the trouble that already exists, that they're making it unavoidable for people, making it impossible for people to turn away from that trouble that exists for many people. So trouble's not a bad word for folks that are trying to make change, but fear and love and all these emotions are part of the journey and part of that work. When I was writing my book, it's a book about activism and climate work. It's also a memoir. It's a very personal story, and I tried to bring my emotions into this work because I felt like this is going to be important. If I want other people to feel something, I need to be vulnerable with my feelings, and so I don't think those even hard feelings like fear and guilt are not ones to be turned away from in this time. They're feelings we can pay attention to and listen to and let them do the work that they need to do to help us, find a good path forward and change the things that need to be changed. It's possible to hold multiple, people who study childhood development will say, children reach a certain stage where they can hold two opposing feelings at the same time. Like that's a marker of childhood development. I noticed it in my own children. When they got to the age, they could be like, I can hold these two opposing feelings at the same time. And I think that's part of the work of community organizing and the work that all of us have to do is to hold the love that we have for the ecosystems that we belong to, that we're part of. I think that I see that embodied or reflected in the photos that are part of this collection. There's a deep, love and wonder there for the mystery that we're all part of. And there's also, fear and concern and alarm for the things that are happening. And out of those, holding those different feelings can give birth to the kinds of work that needs to happen right now in this moment. Was there more specific?
No, that's friendly. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, the effect of these things, right? As a curator, you're setting up a gallery of things that obviously affected the photographer, that obviously were calling, and so these kind of emotional realities seem relevant here. One last question, and then I'm going to invite folks for cookies and to grab something to drink and visit a little bit more informally. Are scientists in a state of mildly suppressed panic? How do scientists deal with the fear? I heard one scientist who was a fisheries researcher on the West Coast looking at salmon migration, and someone on Ideas, CBC, gave them, they said, a stump to stand on and give their thing. And she, her name escapes me, but from UBC, she said, scientists are in a state of mildly suppressed panic here. The fear was present in her voice. And when a scientist speaks like that, I feel like something's happening in my gut. Even if you stay in your lane in your research on the ice, the questions on the ships in the long darkness, where do those conversations go with your colleagues, with other scientists that are accompanying and doing the work alongside?
Yeah. It's a tricky question. There are certainly people who are completely, what to say? There are certainly people who, sound the alarms with a complete view towards sort of the doomsday. And sometimes I feel like that can go too far, because I think if you preach a complete doomsday scenario, you lose people. It sort of leaves a sense of apathy. Like, okay, well, if it's going to completely fall apart, does me driving an electric car really change anything? Especially sometimes the scale of it all. So I try not to go too far towards the doomsday scenario, but I would also say that the thought of there being an ice-free Arctic Ocean just sounds totally absurd. And then when you do think of the impacts of that, the impacts extend just beyond the local system. They extend beyond the Arctic Ocean. So, first of all, you think, okay, there's no Arctic sea ice. Okay, so there's no habitat for polar bears. There's no travel platform for Inuit to continue to hunt and sort of live their traditional lifestyle off of. But then you think of sort of the broader impacts. And so something I mentioned earlier were the feedbacks. And so if you lose the Arctic ice pack, now you're amplifying warming around the world. And one of the things I always like to clarify is that the loss of sea ice doesn't contribute to sea level rise. The sea ice is already in hydrostatic equilibrium. It's not displacing any more water. But I've started to work with some glaciologists, and you see the rapid loss of glaciers and their contribution to sea level rise. And I think that sea level rise is a really, for some people in the middle of the prairies where we're far away from the coastline, it can be a little abstract to try to appreciate sea level rise. But it is a fact of the matter that a vast majority of our population around the globe lives, I forget what the stat is, but it's within X meters of the sea level. So when you think about sea level rise, I think that kind of gets to sort of the broader global system, and sea ice is a part of that, but sea ice is a part of that system that can amplify and speed up the rest of that system.
Yep.
I do also think, there is some point, it is worth considering, humans with mitigation and adaptation. I think there are steps that we can take in there. Their effectiveness, I'm not totally certain of. I always think back, Winnipeg is a prime example of kind of adaptation and mitigation. We have this gigantic dike that goes all the way around our city. We, at the time, I know it was scrutinized a lot, but every couple of years now, it essentially saves Winnipeg. And so I think in some instances, there are solutions that are available, but I think overall, it requires massive changes. Yeah.
Thank you. Those are good words to leave on. We have food. We have some coffee. There are books and copies of books. Martha's here to visit as well. I want to thank Dave and Sarah and Josiah for making it out on a cold winter night to engage in a good conversation. I want to thank MHC Gallery for putting this together, Common Word for staying open, and CMU Press for taking on interesting topics and producing lovely books. If you haven't held this one in your hand, you should. It's nice, and the essays at the beginning that Sue talked about are well worth reading. It'll give you a sense of what Dave and Sarah are up to when they're not looking at photographs or looking closely at ice. Thanks to all of you. I'd encourage you to stick around and visit a little bit. Thank you, Sue, for gathering us all in with your work as the editor at the CMU Press. And thanks for coming. Let's give them a hand here.
Thanks for facilitating.
Thank you. Yeah. I feel like we have gotten very, very close to getting started.
I know. That was great.
That was really fun. Oh, thanks. You guys are, I really meant it when I said you bring in good performers, and it's very, very easy to do this.